Hello, everyone, and welcome to Path to Wellness for Older Persons, Body, Mind, Spirit. This is the last webinar of the Vibrant Voices series for this year. My name is Muriel Howden. I am the Executive Assistant and Senior Outreach Advisor for RTO ERO. I will be moderating today's session and providing active offer for any participants who wish to ask questions or have information relayed in French. Throughout the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A box to submit your questions for our guest speakers. Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue au webinaire Les voies du bien-être pour les aînés, le corps, l'âme et l'esprit, qui est notre dernier webinaire de la série Voix vibrantes pour cette année. Je suis Muriel Howden, adjointe de direction et conseillère en liaison à RTO ERO. Je serai la modératrice de notre session d'aujourd'hui et je vous invite à poser vos questions ou à partager vos commentaires en français dans la boîte de conversation questions et réponses afin de les soumettre à nos invités. As we begin the webinar today, we would like to pay our respects to the Indigenous lands that connect us across Canada. And then our board chair, Rich Prophet, will introduce today's guest speakers. I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge, recognize, and honor the ancestral traditional territories on which we live and work, and the contributions of all Indigenous peoples to our communities and our nation. Je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations, incluant les peuples Mississauga de Crédit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee et Wendat, qui abritent aujourd'hui de nombreux membres des peuples des Premières Nations, Inuit et Métis. Nous reconnaissons et honorons les territoires traditionnels ancestraux sur lesquels nous vivons et travaillons, ainsi que la contribution de tous les peuples autochtones à nos communautés et à notre nation. Merci, thank you, miigwech. Rich? And Rich is going to come to introduce our wonderful two guest speakers.
And it basically says that I cannot start my video. There it comes on now.
You're here.
Yes. Hello, my name is Rich Prophet. I'm the chair of the board at RTO ERO. Thank you for joining us today. RTO ERO is a bilingual trusted voice on healthy active living in the retirement journey. We work with our members and partners to advocate for critical policy improvements to address urgent needs now and create a more secure and compassionate future for everyone. Our three key advocacy issues are senior strategies, geriatric healthcare, and environmental stewardship. The focus for today's session, as Muriel mentioned, is paths to wellness for older persons, body, mind, spirit. It is on a geriatric healthcare and senior strategy. I am pleased to introduce our first panelist, who is no stranger to our members and older adults in British Columbia and across Canada. Isabel McKenzie is a seniors advocate for the province of British Columbia. Over the last 2 decades, she has worked in various aspects of care to support older adults. She has served on a number of national and provincial boards and commissions and was instrumental in pioneering a new model of dementia care that is now a national best practice. Our second panelist is Dr. Carrie Lee Cassidy. She is a national leader in positivism in healthcare and an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy. Dr. Cassidy is a professor of psychiatry and the clinical academic director of Dalhousie's Geriatric Psychiatry Program at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Dr. Cassidy also founded the Foundation of Health, a national nonprofit association that supports behavioral change to promote brain health and resilience. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Muriel Howden, to start the webinar. Muriel?
Thank you very much, Rich. Before we begin, I just would like to remind everyone to submit your questions in English or French using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our two panelists will address as many questions as we can at the end of their presentations. So, je vous rappelle que vous pouvez poser vos questions ou partager vos commentaires en français dans la boîte de conversation questions et réponses au bas de votre écran afin de les soumettre à nos deux invités qui pourront y répondre à la fin de leur présentation. So let's begin with Isabelle Mackenzie. Isabelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Muriel, et bonjour, and hello to everybody on the webinar. I am speaking to you from Victoria, British Columbia, which is the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations of our country. So I'm just going to start with a share screen here, get that up and running, and I am going to get somebody to give me a thumbs up that they see my slideshow. Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit of a context of the picture of seniors in British Columbia, because it really looks very similar to the national average. And as we know, the national average is usually determined by what happens in Ontario, because Ontario so overwhelms the rest of Canada. So while these numbers are BC numbers, you can expect that they look very similar for Ontario. And I know that some of the members of the association live in different provinces. Most provinces look similar. Alberta has a slightly younger population, and the Maritimes has a slightly older population. But for the most part, the order of magnitude is the same. So the first thing about seniors is that when we look at 65 plus, where are people living? Over 9 out of 10 people over 65 live independently. They might live in a condominium or a townhouse, but it's their own home. Even at the age of 85, which is when we start to see some significant shifts, we find that more than 7 out of 10 seniors are still living completely independently at age 85 plus. About 10% are living in what we might call retirement homes or assisted living, or sometimes it's called seniors independent living, where you have your own apartment but some common dining and activities. And about 10%, pardon me, and about 15% of people 85 and over live in what we would call a nursing home or a long-term care home or a residential care facility. So I think we can take great comfort to know that for the most part, most of us will live the entirety of our life in our own home. And that while it is possible that we might want to move to congregate setting or need a nursing home, in all probability, it's less likely than not that will be required. Income, however, can be a challenge. So the median income for a senior in BC, and this is a little bit higher than the national average. So median, as you know, half is over, half is under. Just under $30,000 a year, depending on where you live in the country and what the expenses are. That can be more challenging. Certainly in big cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, it's going to be much more challenging. But we do know that while there are some income supports, certainly for seniors who don't have workplace pensions like public servants have, it is and can be very challenging, and the choices that you have as you age might be a bit different. Looking at the healthcare status also gives us a little bit of good news and hope and inspiration for the future. So this is looking at BC's population and looking at our diagnostic codes through our physician billing system. So it's a fairly robust, accurate data system. So one of the things to notice is that under 65, the prevalence of dementia is almost imperceptible. It can happen. Early onset dementia certainly does occur. It's possible, but it's not very probable. It's very rare that we would see the onset of dementia under the age of 65. When we look at over 65, the prevalence in the entire population over 65 is 6%. So that still means 94% don't have a diagnosis of a dementia. But what's interesting is when we look at the 65 to 84 age group, actually that number drops to 3%. and then rises significantly at 85 plus to 20%. But 80% of people 85 and over do not have a diagnosis of dementia. So again, yes, it is possible. The probability of developing dementia does rise with age. It is a neurological degenerative disease for which we don't have a cure, but there are management tools. But most people will live the entirety of their life, not only in their own home, but as I like to joke, they'll keep all their marbles, or most of them, however few or many they may be, for most of their life as well. And so that's an important thing to think about as we're planning for a future. Even when we look at high complexity chronic conditions. So this category would capture people who have more than one thing. So hypertension in and of itself is not placing you in high complexity chronic conditions, but if you had hypertension and diabetes, or hypertension and COPD, or renal chronic kidney disease, these would place you in the high complex chronic conditions. So under 65, we're a healthy population. 65 plus, 19% of people, 1 out of 5, have high complexity chronic conditions. A little bit less than that in our 65 to 84 group, but pretty much doubles at the age of 85 to 35% of our population. But again, that means the majority, 65% of people 85 plus, don't actually have high complexity chronic conditions. Most people actually are quite healthy in their later years as well. And again, we see this in long-term care, where 4% of the population 65 plus live in long-term care, actually drops to 2% at 65 to 84, and then at 85 plus rises to 15%. So again, some context for understanding the importance of the whole theme of your session around healthy aging and the paths for wellness. That really is very hopeful. Now, that is not to say that people will not require long-term care and healthcare services as they age. Some will, absolutely. And the challenge is you can't really predict accurately who is going to require those. What we do know is that for the most part, while by the time you're age 85 or 90, your income doesn't actually determine whether you have better health. It does determine the options you have available to you. And that's where I think looking and planning and having a plan for the resources that are needed is important. Now, you also wanted to learn a little bit about this office and the role of advocacy. So the Office of the Seniors Advocate was created in 2014, and it's based on legislation called the Seniors Advocate Act, which was passed in BC actually the year before the office was formed. So this is a statutory office created by government. And in the legislation governing this office, we have a mandate to monitor and analyze seniors' services and issues. We make recommendations to government and service providers to address systemic issues. It's not a regulatory body. We don't have a regulatory function. Our powers and authority really extend to compelling information from providers, compelling data, and the ability to report directly to the public. We can't actually make the government do anything or make a service provider do anything other than provide us with the information. On an annual basis, we get about 13,000 calls and just under 3,000 letters and emails, and we have a website that gets just under 100,000 visits a year. So obviously an interest out there. And you know, in BC, we always, when we're looking at Ontario, we always multiply by 3. And that would be the proportionality for the application to Ontario. So in terms of the effectiveness of the office and what can this office do, and you know, these are just a little bit of a catch-all of some of the headlines. The main, I think, power of offices like this, and this office in particular, has been the power to empower the public, particularly seniors, with the information, with the data, that it is our job is not to defend what governments are doing. To some extent, we will explain what they are doing, but we can identify the gaps and we can put out the information that if you can capture the public's imagination on the issues impacting seniors, you will see that the political will to address those issues will follow. So if we look in British Columbia, this office started reporting on our hours of care that were delivered in long-term care, which led to the recognition we weren't delivering the hours of care that we had a policy to deliver, which led to a commitment to increase those hours of care. And we have effectively reached that milestone now. And we've seen that in other areas as well. When we talked about in the income area, a senior supplement in British Columbia that is for our lowest income seniors that hadn't changed in 27 years. And in the most recent budget, we saw a doubling of that amount. Again, bringing the attention to the public of these issues, and then the public are who is going to push the politicians and the political will to make the changes. So I think there is value to offices like this. I think there's value to regulatory regimes as well, but just within the realm of advocacy, I think there is a tremendous amount of value, and it would be my hope that we would see similar offices to this in provinces across the country. That hasn't happened to date. Newfoundland does have an office of the seniors advocate, but they're a small province, and so it's maybe a little under-resourced. And New Brunswick has one that shares common administration with the Office of the Children's Representative or the Children's Advocate as well. The challenge from a federal perspective is that most issues affecting seniors are under provincial jurisdiction. The only thing under federal jurisdiction are the income supports of CPP, OAS, and GIS. And so while a federal seniors advocate might be effective, really it is the provincial level where you see the levers, if you will, that need to be pulled in order to see real changes in the lives of seniors. So there is the contact information for my office. The website is there, lots of information, and you can call my office and get a live voice answering your call, and we'll hopefully direct you into the right space. So I will stop sharing at that point and turn it back over to you, Muriel.
Thank you, Isabel Mackenzie. Thank you so much for this great presentation. Just a reminder, we'll take the questions after. So we will now be welcoming Dr. Carrie Lee Cassidy for her presentation.
Thank you, Muriel. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to this important group. And I'm speaking to you, as was mentioned, from Nova Scotia, which is the territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I also wanted just to commend the organizers for the diversity of perspectives, geographical diversity here from one side of the country to the other. And also the theme from policy and advocacy at a sort of structural level to this talk, which is also very much about empowering people, but in a slightly different way, in a less of the top-down and more the bottom-up kind of way, which is what can we do as individuals in our own lives? And the theme here is how to thrive in retirement. So I find with my own work that it's helpful in working one-on-one with people, or even just thinking about it for myself, to stop and have a bit of self-reflection. So if we're going to think about how to thrive in our retirement phase, it helps to stop and think about what are my expectations, my hopes, my fears, and to put those out on the table. So for some people thinking ahead, it tends to be, the fantasy of what it will be when we finally don't have to be cracking the whip at work all the time, and that we'll have this ability to kind of start the party. Can't wait. The clock is ticking down. Some people are very, very eager for this next chapter. Another possible fantasy would be escapism. We finally get to go to the Caribbean for any length of time we want, or some other way of really relaxing and de-stressing, and that this is what retirement means to us. Likewise, there can be a lot of worries and fears about this future unknown phase, whether it's impending or you're already in it, that it could be really boring and dull, sitting at home twiddling your thumbs with nothing to do, and an anxiety about what it means to suddenly have all this unstructured time. Or it can be a real fear of becoming lonely or isolated, or even possibly depressed in the face of such a big change in lifestyle, and cut off from friends and colleagues. So it can actually, when people actually experience the retirement, it can be a combination of these things. But let's face it, the current context to reflect on is extremely stressful around the entire globe. So when we reflect on our life, it has to be put in the context of current reality. So no matter what your hopes, fantasies, or fears might have been, it's all entwined now with the impacts of an epidemic that has changed everybody's lives in countless ways, limiting us, restricting us, forcing us to behave in completely new ways, socially, from a health perspective. And also a reality of our current times is the broader, global environment, political and natural. I don't know about you, but I find this fall to be rather warm out in Nova Scotia. And we have right now, the Global Summit on Climate Change. So at a global level, there's stress, but at a personal level, the reality of one's day-to-day life can include the care of an aging parent. So you're dealing with one's own aging, but also family members who may become more frail, need our help. We may have adult children who are going through their own life stresses, problems, maybe divorce, conflict, what's happening for the grandchildren or their children, your dear grandchildren, and how you may help or be part of that, entwined with that. And then concerns for yourself, the chronic conditions, as Isabel referred to, do increase with age, and so there may be new health issues that you have or may be coming around the corner that are a source of stress. So in this context, with our fantasies, our fears, and our realities, what does it really mean to thrive, which is the title of this talk? If you look at the definition of what it means to thrive, it is to progress toward or realize a goal despite or because of circumstances. In other words, we don't have to have perfect conditions in order to thrive. In fact, the resilience research would say that one doesn't have resilience unless it's in the face of struggle and conflict. So it is a precondition to the development of resilience. And so to progress towards a goal, even though we have these conflicts, these fears, it is really possible. The question is, are we armed with the right knowledge, tools, and support to thrive, to make the most of this next phase in our lives? And how would you know? So the Fountain of Health is trying to empower people with the right knowledge, tools, and supports. And it's a project that I've been involved with, if you go back a slide there, Muriel, for about 10 years now. It's a knowledge translation project that is a nonprofit offering training and tools to support people's well-being at any stage and phase at the level of the individual, organizations like yours, and clinicians who are doing this frontline work. So we don't have policy, but we offer tools and training. You can find this information on our website, which is fountainofhealth.ca. Obviously, it's a play on the Fountain of Youth, but who needs youth when you can have good health, right? So you can register for workshops. The Optimal Aging Workshop is a 4-week virtual workshop if you're interested. And also there's an app, which is a web-based app that you can use if you have the internet and an email account. So there's no going to a store downloading. It is usable on any device. It's called the Wellness App, wellnessapp.ca. What you'll find on the website in the next few months is a new learning center where we will be making it even easier to register and log in for the various courses and training that's offered here. The Thrive model of well-being involves 6 key domains that I'll get into in a minute. And before I do, I wanted to acknowledge others in the team, just so you know this kind of work isn't done in isolation. Clearly, I have a large community of professionals involved in this work. You can see the different organizations who are partners in the leadership team. And I just want to draw your attention to Dr. Erica Frank, who is Canada's Research Chair on Preventative Medicine. And so she's a member of this group. If you, okay, yes, so we have 3 people highlighted here. Dr. Dilip Jesti on the left there is the founding father of what's called positive psychiatry and a mentor of mine. Dr. Michael Vallis, next in the top left, is the behavioral psychologist who founded the Behavior Change Institute. And then Dr. Erica Frank below him is the Canada's Research Chair of Preventative Medicine. So together we're doing this work to try to get the message out across Canada. So when we think about what does it mean to thrive, it's worth thinking about this illness-wellness continuum that basically the idea of waiting for a disease to strike us before we begin to consider how to promote our well-being is often the way we go, but it may not be the best path. That many of us will sit in what you could call a comfort zone, that, well, there's no problem here, so I'll just keep going. And yet there are some places in some countries and some venues where there's even lower levels of chronic disease in the older population. So while we do very well, as Isabel mentioned, like the majority of people are aging in a healthy state, it is possible to further reduce that burden of disease in a population overall. And when you look at what are the specific ingredients to help with that, of course, social determinants of health, a lot of things that are environmental, make a difference. But there are things at an individual level that people can do that protects health. And so moving out of a comfort zone and becoming more proactive as an individual or within a community to optimize health is something that is possible, and something that I would encourage you to be thinking about. Why bother? So why would we work on these things? It turns out that only about 25% of human longevity is accounted for by inherited family genes. In other words, there's a huge amount of our health that is determined at an individual level by what's called epigenetic factors. And that is things that happen after our birth, after the things we're born with. And so, of course, environment is a big one, but so is our own personal lifestyle and even our outlook. Fascinating work on how longevity and optimism go hand in hand. And I wanted to take a minute to tell you about this concept in neuroscience called brain neuroplasticity. And it has become a little better known, but it's really a brand new idea. And that is that it is possible for the brain to continue to rewire, to continue to set down new neurons and reshape itself throughout our entire lives, even into old age. And as a group of teachers, this should very much resonate. that, we talk about lifelong learning. Well, it happens at a cellular level. The ability to shape our own minds through our activities is what the focus is on in the Thrive model. These are high impact activities and habits that shape our minds and shape our bodies in a way that protects us against chronic disease developing or making it more difficult to cope with. That is our thinking habits, physical health habits like physical activity and our nutrition, our relationship habits, the way and the quality with which we connect to others, our interests and our ability to continue to challenge our mind with absorbing pastimes and challenges. This one is a key in the Thrive model. It is matching our values, what we think is most meaningful with us, with the things we spend our time on, and doing it in a way that allows us to actually accomplish them. And our emotional habits. How do we de-stress when the stress levels go high? How do we use our awareness of our emotions to acknowledge them? And whether we're getting into actually mental illness, to recognize that and to seek help appropriately. These are all really key. And en français, les traits des pensées, l'habitude de santé, relation, intérêt, valeur et émotion. Merci, Muriel. So the science of well-being could be translated then into these actions. And this is what I find very exciting and why I've been doing this for 10 years. And it's regardless of socioeconomic. It is independent of cultural affiliation. Obviously, they need to be translated into opportunity and access and a sense of community. But actually, often disenfranchised communities do this better in some ways. They will connect with each other. They will be generous in their social engagement. They will have a lot of compassion for one another, show kindness. But when people think about what makes people happy, it turns out to be a lot of things that is accessible to anyone. Money does not buy happiness. Opportunity actually often buys misery. When you think about the things that actually show in science to improve people's well-being, it is time affluence. Time affluence, which anyone moving into retirement is going to have, I hope. It is the ability to be idle while also at other times then being engaged in interesting, absorbing activity that gives us mental flow without distraction and interruption nonstop. It is thinking about others, showing compassion not only to others, but also to ourselves, having gratitude for whatever it is we have. And when I think about in the Mi'kmaq community, there's a teaching of the elders of basic principles, which really, have to do with virtues. Like there's a lot of overlap in those teachings, and what science is telling us promotes our well-being. Good citizenship. So self-esteem, unfortunately, in our culture, we tend to overemphasize self-esteem at the expense of community, at the expense of what you would call self-compassion. So if we are too invested in what we quote accomplish and some social expectations of success, the minute we falter, we can be really hard on ourselves. We can be highly critical and feel ashamed, and that leads us not to even share our hardest moments or admit them to even ourselves or to others. So what helps us thrive is actually the ability to speak in a compassionate way to ourselves in our hardest moments. I wanted to give you a couple of anecdotes that lets you know that physicians are also in need of this work. And I'm working with colleagues in projects to bring this to the physician audience. So here's an example of a colleague who has been using the Thrive approach, and he posted it on social media. So Dr. Chris Frank set the goal to do a wheelie on his bicycle. And he had been hoping to do this since he was 6, and he decided it was going to happen before he turned 60. So he did manage, and he says, Fountain of Health rocks. I set this goal and it has improved my quality of life. What did Dr. Frank do? Here are the 3 steps. Step 1 is that self-reflection, which we talked about earlier. Where am I now in these Thrive domains? Second is to set a goal, and it's not just any goal, it's a micro goal. The third is to write it down and track the progress, at least over a few weeks. It sounds very basic, but to do it is a different matter. What's so important about the tiny goal is that it sets us up for success. And when we have success, what happens is called the cognitive ripple effect. So this tiny little drop of water hits the water. And what happens from there is the cognitive effect. And that is, instead of feeling helpless, the thoughts change to ones of self-efficacy. I can do this. That was fun. I think I'll repeat it. It over time becomes a new behavioral habit, and our identity shifts from being a couch potato, let's say, to somebody who is invested in their personal physical health. And that is the magic of the tiny goal. What's beautiful about it and exciting is that no goal is actually too small. As long as it's moving in the right direction towards improved self-care, improved health, that something that you think you could enjoy and stick with over some time, that's what makes the difference in long-term health outcomes. Just like an airplane, if it shifts the degree of its trajectory by one degree at takeoff in a couple of minutes, it won't have any impact. But over a few hours, it could land in a very different city or even country. Does this work? I'm happy to say, yes, it does. We've tested this in over 2,000 clinicians who are trained to use this approach with their patients. And in over 1,500 subjects, we have had our outcomes that showed, I think it's on the next slide, Muriel, that over 80% of people at least partially meet that goal within 4 weeks, but better than that, they have improved health attitudes and increased self-reported well-being. And that's what we were hoping for. So I invite you to learn more about the science of well-being and behavior change through the Fountain of Health website, through the Optimal Aging 4-week workshop, or through trying out the Wellness app. And as I mentioned, we're trying to put together a better interface for the public on these tools and how to access them through the Learning Center, so stay tuned. Yes, and I hope we can have further discussion about this, about what does this mean for you personally? What would purposeful retirement be for you at a personal level and at a broader sense in your own families and communities? How could you bring this knowledge to help you?
Wow. So first of all, a very big thank you to Isabel Mackenzie and Dr. Keri Cassidy. Incredible presentation. So we're now entering the question and the answer phase of our session. I see that we have actually a lot of questions that have come in, so this is great. I will send them to Dr. Keri Cassidy or Isabel Mackenzie. And of course, if one of you want to add, please don't hesitate. So, juste un rappel que vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en anglais dans la boîte de questions et réponses qui est au bas de votre écran. Nous allons répondre au plus de questions possibles dans le temps que nous avons avec Dr. Keri Cassidy et Isabel Mackenzie. So I'm going to start with the first question. I think this one actually came during your presentation, Isabel. So I think this one would be probably for you. I know you were talking about this. What causes the percentage drop in the age group from 65 to 84?
Two things. First of all, the denominator is much larger for the 65 to 84 group. So the proportion drops, even though an absolute number may be larger. And in order of magnitude, it's about 800,000 people in the 65 to 84 compared to about 120,000 in the 85 plus. So that's part of it. But I think the other part of it, and that was the behind showing the age stratification over 65, is really to understand that for a good part of our life in retirement or as a senior, defined as 65 and older, we're actually very healthy. And that it's really when we start to get into our mid 80s that you're starting to see these issues. And even then, you're not seeing them as predominantly as the images or the preconceived notion would have us believe. I think the very important message, and it's reinforced by what Dr. Cassidy was saying, is that when you look at where we are in our health from age 65 until we die, most of us, for most of those years, are pretty healthy. And we need to think about that and the kinds of things we can engage in that can help us, as Dr. Cassidy has said, increase those number of years and push off the years of disability, for want of a better term, that we may experience in our final months or years of life. So really, it's a reflection of the fact that most of us, when we're seniors, are pretty healthy, just like most of us are living in our own homes.
Thank you, Isabel. And actually, the next question is for you, but maybe Dr. Carolee Cassidy will want to add to it. I think it's really a continuation to what you just said. The question from Mallory is, but to what extent might these numbers reflect a lack of diagnosis for senior 85 plus due to the thinking that dementia and high complexity conditions are simply natural at that age?
On the high complexity chronic conditions, it's not an underreporting if you've gone to a physician for that condition. So these are based on diagnostic codes. On the dementia front, there's always this debate, right? Every illness and disease is undiagnosed until it's diagnosed, right? So every disease where we're giving prevalence is by definition underreporting because there's people who have not yet been diagnosed. I think the issue is, by the time a person's activities of daily living have been impacted by a dementia, they are diagnosed. So are there people out there with undiagnosed dementia? Absolutely. But it's at a stage in their life where the impact is mild enough that they haven't gone to their physician or gone to the emergency department or the hospital and had this formal diagnosis made. One of the, this is a lot about stereotypes and ageism, and seniors can be as guilty of it as everybody else. And one of the stereotypes is that you're going to lose your mind and you don't have, and we really have to think about this because it links to capacity and our ability to make decisions for ourselves and the willingness of others, particularly governments, to step in and decide that they should be making the decisions for us. And we saw that in spades during the pandemic, particularly around visit restrictions in long-term care. So we need to be very, very careful. There are the brain, like the body, slows as we age, but it doesn't seize, right? The difference is we can see the body still functions, albeit maybe a little slower at 85. We don't see the mind as it's working and it's slower, but it's going to get there. And so we project onto older adults, particularly those as they get into their 80s, our need to step in when really if we just give time and space, just like they'll get across the street, it might take 90 seconds instead of 60 seconds. They'll get to the conclusion that they need to get to. It just might take them 90 seconds instead of 60 seconds.
That is such a good point. It's really so much to change in the mindset as well. Dr. Kiralee Casey, did you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, no, I would just echo some of what Isabel has said and just maybe elaborate a bit more, is that ageism and stereotypes about aging is a very big issue for us in our culture. And it can foreclose our own future through kind of self-determined destiny. So in other words, there's research showing that our own outlook about aging has an impact on health outcomes. And without getting too much into that science, it's one of the areas that I find really fascinating. And I've reflected a lot about this, so in a bunch of ways. One is that society, culture, medicine included, hasn't caught up with the greatest success story of modern medicine. That in the last 100 years, our life expectancy has nearly doubled from 50 to 86 or more in a very, very short period of time of human history. So up until 100 years ago, 50 was an advanced age. And now we have this almost a whole other lifetime ahead of us at that midpoint that we haven't quite figured out what it means. And medicine is very much at fault too for pathologizing aging as a gradual deterioration of our faculties and our physical health to the point of death. But that is not the human experience by and large. Often people are discovering all kinds of things about their potential. And we see every day, because of the sheer numbers of people who are much older in their 70s, in their 80s. Look at the Queen of England, or her husband, who are thriving well into a very, very late stage of life. To know that this medical model is very limited. And so I think it's really important that we help society and ourselves break that down and to be tapping into our human potential, which is why I'm so interested in positivism in medicine, because it's sorely lacking.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So Isabel, I'll send the next one to you, although again, I think Kiralee may have to add as well. This question came in French, so let me read it in French first and then I'll read it in English. So the question is, hormis les résidences de soins longue durée, est-ce que l'instauration des communautés de vie pour aînés est une bonne idée? So apart from long-term care residences, is the idea of senior living communities a good one? Isabel? Yeah.
For some people it is. I mean, I think, the biggest takeaway is people will want to live differently in retirement, just as they want to live differently before retirement, right? Some people want to live in the country. Some people want to live an urban life. Some people want the lock it and leave it convenience of a condo. Some people like to putter in a garden. We don't fundamentally change who we are. So what social engagement is absolutely important, but what constitutes social engagement is different for different people. Some people, a daily interaction, for some a weekly interaction, for some it's minute by minute interaction. Different people will have different thresholds for what is required to keep them engaged. So communities with many people will absolutely work for some people. There will be others who will say, not for me. And I think it's our job to just respect that people's capacity to make a decision about where they want to live and who they want to live with stays with most of us for a very long time. And we just need to respect what people choose.
Kiralee?
Yes, some have referred to institutional living as like the apartheid of Western culture. this assumption that older people only want to be with other older people is clearly not true for everybody. Now, of course, there's pragmatics involved, that once somebody needs nursing care level of care on a day-to-day basis, there are just some pragmatics that make it necessary. But clearly, as Isabel points out, what would be ideal is that people could shape their own future and have a wide variety of choices about what that might look like.
Thank you. I'll stay with you, Carolee, for the next question from Mona. And of course, Isabel, please feel free to add to it. But the question is, how do you meet the needs of the various ethnic communities?
Yeah, I touched on that a bit here. Mm-hmm. And I think, the limitations of the work that I'm involved with is that it isn't embedded within Health Canada or the Public Health Agency or some other major effort to enter into as many communities as possible. The method by which it would be ideal would be to start with dialogue about what's important in any given community, what's the response, and then a co-creation of how best to translate the science and these approaches in that particular community. But I touched on the fact that a lot of the basic principles about what makes for well-being is cross-cutting, and therefore, would be really relevant. And in many communities where there's less affluence or less opportunity, people will already have a lot of these aspects that promote well-being embedded in the fabric of the community. But certainly, there are going to be community specific issues and challenges related to social determinants of health, access, opportunity, poverty, and so on, that would have to be addressed.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll send probably the next one to Isabel Mackenzie, and then I will actually, for the following question, I will call the chair of the board, Rich Profit, and our CEO, Jim Grieve, to help us with this one. But I'm going to go to Phil's question. I need to tell you, Phil is actually writing to us from England. So I just want to say we're welcoming our participants from all over the world and all continents, and we're delighted about this. So Isabel, here's the question. So social isolation is a real threat to vulnerable seniors. The heat dome in the summer 2021 resulted in hundreds of deaths of vulnerable seniors in Vancouver alone. Is there some type of programming or registration possible to identify vulnerable seniors living without family or without community support?
The short answer is yes. And I think that is a piece of work we're doing here in British Columbia right now, where we saw during a 4-day heat dome the consequences of, I think it was about 800 deaths, and 70% of them were people over the age of 65. We're finding that the biggest risk factor was living alone. It may even be an exclusive risk factor. In other words, every case was a person living alone. We're still getting that data. And then looking at other factors. So living in an apartment, did that enhance? But, one of the things is living alone is a risk factor for a whole host of things. So the heat dome and heat exhaustion and not understanding what's happening until it's too late is but one example. But falls, if you live alone and you fall, you can be unable to call for help and be undiscovered for several days. Medication errors, there's just a whole host of things that tell us living alone without any connection is the risk, right? So it is around how do we get on a more daily basis the kinds of connections that will provide that sense of security. And the person's in England, where of course the best thing to come out of England was the road to Scotland. But other than that, it was over in the UK where about, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, they had this Minister of Loneliness established, right? And it caused a great cacophony of media sound. And you sort of sit back and you go, wait a minute, the government's going to tell us we all have to play with each other. At the end of the day, government doesn't solve this. we solve this. This is about us as individuals. And it's about whether the person is 90 or 20. And it is about this shift we've made. When you think about it, all this automation that's made all these things easier have disconnected us from everybody. We don't talk to the checkout girl at the grocery counter anymore because we scan our own groceries. We don't talk to the bank teller anymore because we do our banking online. We don't, the list goes on. We don't go into the post office to get the stamp anymore because we don't mail anything, right? And at every one of these benefits of more time, we've removed ourselves from interactions with people. And that's, I think, those chickens have come home to roost. And more so for older people who are more likely to live alone. So at the age of 65, I can't remember, it's something like 20% of people live alone. But by the time you're 85, that more than doubles. And as you keep going, it's going to increase. Generally, it's the death of the spouse. And at that point in life, those interactions that we had in our daily activities of life, we need those. And we've got to think about unintended consequences of some of our modern approaches to things.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. So, Carrie, I will send the next question to you. I will start with you, but I will also call the chair of the board, Rich Prophet, and our CEO, Jim Grieve, who may have to add to this. So let's start with you, Dr. Cassidy. At the simplest levels, how may everyone fight ageism?
So the simplest is, of course, to start with things you have direct influence over at a personal level. There's lots of other more complicated things, but if I'm to try to be true to your question, and Isabel referred to this too, is there's a body of literature. It's called the stereotype embodiment theory. But to say that in simple terms, it's basically ageism directed at ourselves. So because of the negative cultural stereotypes of what it means to grow older, in general, we'll think of somebody who's older as anybody who's at least 15 or 20 years older than we are, rather than ourselves. So if and when we start to see signs that represent this stereotype, a gray hair or, a new health condition or trouble with vision or whatever it is, new problems that remind us about the stereotype, it can have a very negative effect on our self-esteem. And this is this sort of negative self-views about aging. So Becca Levy out of Yale University studied the effect of negative self-views about aging and found that people who had a more positive outlook lived 7.5 years longer than those with a negative outlook. This is twice as long as the benefit of not smoking or being physically active. Loneliness similarly has a very big impact. So that's what Isabel was talking about. That's why there was a minister of loneliness established, because the health impact was finally recognized. So valuing ourselves, having compassion with ourselves for any changes that we might be experiencing and going through is a very important first step. It makes us more likely to empathize with those who are further along in that process. And also, by empathizing with ourselves, we're better able to take actions rather than to feel helpless, depressed, or disengaged.
Thank you. And Rich?
Thanks, Muriel. Following along with some of the concepts that Dr. Cassidy mentioned, loneliness and social isolation, very interestingly, RTO ERO Foundation started on October the 6th, a program entitled Chime In. And this is where any member can join from across Canada every Wednesday from 1 to 2, and they discuss various topics. Now, I know I've been involved in 3 of the sessions, and very simple concepts. Last week, we discussed what types of music people like. I know I was in chat rooms with people from Kamloops, people from Algonquin, people from Toronto, people from Ottawa, various groups. But every week, people are involved in this. And they've indicated that they are lonely, and that's why they're involved. They enjoy the opportunity to interact. That's one thing. Education. I think Alison said, hey, it's up to us to decide what has to be done. And very interestingly, in one of the upcoming editions of Renaissance is a balanced life. And what we have to address, as the two speakers said, is not just the physical exercises that we have to address, it's the mental components that we must address. Because if you don't address the mental concept, then stress comes into play. And the greater the stress, obviously, the greater the problems that are with respect to that. As I said, education, I've noticed in Dr. Cassidy's list of groupings that it was, one was the International Longevity Center. And that is where RTO ERO has become involved with the UN Convention for Older Adults. That's what we're advocating very much so with respect to that. And lastly, I just want to say the education, we know we need a cultural change. Unfortunately, in some cultures, the indigenous culture, those who are aged are highly regarded. But in our culture, oh, well, Rich, you're doing not too bad for a guy that's 75 years old. Well, that's a very negative concept, and we have to change that idea, and that is called education with respect to that. Jim?
Well, thank you very, very much. And Dr. Cassidy and Isabel, you're doing a superb job in stimulating the conversation here. But the issue here is fighting ageism. That's the question. How do you fight ageism? Rich has given you some really terrific ideas about what RTO ERO is trying to do with and for our members and seniors across Canada. I'm a little hoarse today because I'm going to talk about personal commitments to fighting ageism. And that is the 10,000 steps a day, the nutrition that you've got to keep as much as you possibly can, the engagement, the entertainment. I'm a little hoarse today because I finally, after 2 years, was able to get back and sing with my band last night. So I need to get my voice back in shape here. It's family connections. For 2 years during this pandemic, you know, it's not good enough to see grandchildren and children by Zoom. It's not enough. You know, in the last few months, being able to have them here and in the backyard and share a meal, so important. These are the things that keep me young and keep me, you know, really engaged. I don't even think about the number of the birthday. I think more about what can I do to sustain friendships and sustain that connection with family and look after my body as well as much as I possibly can. I don't worry about these well-deserved gray hairs because I earned them, every one of them. And ageism is just a place. I think it's just we're surrounded by ageist issues, but you only have to pay attention to them if you really must. Because as we learned earlier in the week, we had a lovely webinar from Candy Palmater, who was speaking about the experience of the Indigenous experience in Canada. And she said, you've got to understand that you first have to love yourself and that you have to be available to the others. You're a terrific person. Look in the mirror every day. And that's, I think, that whole mindfulness notion of being centered is so important. And our Renaissance magazine, which has won numerous awards, features issues on exercise and nutrition and mindfulness and all of those things that fight the issue that we're talking about here, which is ageism.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I thank you, Rich Prophet. Thank you, Jim Grieve. I'm going to move. Time is going way too fast. So I'm going to move to our last few questions because we are, believe it or not, down to our probably 10, 12 minutes. The next question is for Dr. Cassidy, but I think the next couple ones I'm going to send to you, Isabel Mackenzie. So the next one for you, Carolee, is are there any studies linking screen time exposure to world news and decline in well-being?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I'm not up on exactly that specific niche, but what I can say is that we do know that our thoughts have a big impact on our well-being. And so anything that stimulates our thoughts towards worry and catastrophe will have a negative impact. So it's important, I know there's been general advice put out there that it's important to basically have a bit of a media diet. So choose very carefully, like healthy nutrition, choose very carefully the sources of information, limit the time spent there, decide just how much of a portion you need to feel informed. Try not to do that right before you go to sleep at night. And that kind of anything that sets off your nervous system. So it's a very individual, I suppose, in a way. Anything that sets off the nervous system to the stress response that then leads to an interference with sleep at night will have a negative health effect. And there's no doubt that we've been super saturated in a lot of very distressing news. The realities of the situation has affected all of us. And so the consumption of that media is a really important aspect to day-to-day well-being and making very selective choices there.
Very nice. Thank you, Kiralee. Anything to add to this, Isabel, or I'm sending you possibly the last questions because the time is moving fast. So,
okay.
And I know, Kiralee, you'll have lots to say on this. So here's for you, Isabel, to start the question from Garth. It's a personal comment and question, but the truth is it's obviously touching so many people. I'm 86 years old and I have had a very happy and positive 30-year retirement. My major issue is dealing with the loss of my wife of 62 years of wonderful marriage. This type of loss will affect all couples. I do not believe you can prepare for grieving and the resulting feeling of loss. Do you have any advice?
Well, he's right. There's nothing that can prepare you for it in reality. And in reality, it's going to happen. Everybody out there who's married and living with their spouse, one spouse will predecease the other in all probability. I do think it's harder when you're older. I think that losing a spouse at a young age, 45 or 50, is tragic in another way, a life cut short. But for the spouse that remains, they're active and engaged. They're probably in the workforce, they're focused. When you're older, what has happened to a greater extent is that your spouse has become your social network, and that the loss of that can be profound for many. I think recognizing it is important. I think understanding the importance of a peer relationship. So who can most empathize? Somebody who has also experienced it, and having those networks and finding a way to link into those networks, whether it be the loss of a spouse through death, or whether the loss of a spouse through Alzheimer's or dementia. That's another kind of loss that spouses can experience as well. Talking to people who've shared that experience is, we believe, the most therapeutic for many. Again, not all, but more than somebody who hasn't experienced it but has theories on it.
Right. Thank you, Isabel. Before we welcome Jim Grieve again for final remarks, Dr. Kiralee Cassidy, do you want to add anything to what Isabel just said?
Yeah, just my sincere condolences. That kind of a loss at any age and stage is so very difficult and requires a great deal of strength to endure, a lot of self-compassion, and really, being able to speak to yourself the way you would your most loved person, as you deal with that loss, can help provide some soothing and solace. And also just to flag that in the context of that kind of loss, people can start to develop signs and symptoms of a depression, which is a clinical condition. So if in that state after a month or two if there are those features. It would be being sad all the time, most of the time for 2 weeks in a row, with loss of appetite and general loss of interest or self-esteem. Those are things that are worth seeking direct help around.
It's such a pleasure to hear you both speak. We view ourselves as RTO ERO as kind of seniors advocates extraordinaire across the country. We certainly believe in that sort of fountain of health as well. And in many cases, where we're dealing with social isolation, we've been proactive for years in this organization in having what we call in each of our districts a goodwill representative or several. These are people who take the time to either call or visit the seniors among us, among our membership, just to check on them, but also to have that conversation. I remember someone saying at one point, this is a representative saying, I went for my 5-minute visit to drop off a poinsettia in the holiday season and stayed 3 hours. And more than anything, that social isolation, that connection with another person is so vital and so missing. And, the whole notion of, can we find a way to bring that kind of inter-age groupings together so that we have young children and older adults very close together, because there's a fountain of youth also from that wonderful source of the early years. Honestly, Isabel, thank you so much for today. And Dr. Carrie-Lee Cassidy, amazing, amazing. I mean, we could go another hour, as Muriel said. This is, sadly, this is the end of our 2021 Vibrant Voices series. We are gearing up for 2022, which comes around the corner in a couple of months. I hope that you'll continue. There's been over 350 people involved in this one today, at least that's the number I saw. And we've recorded this, so it's going to be posted on the website, and that's on vibrantvoices.ca. It'll take a couple of weeks because we make sure that it's AOD compliant and that it is bilingual and available to you very shortly. So, we're working on our webinar series for 2022. We'll keep everyone informed about what's coming. We're looking for your ideas too. Are there people you'd like to hear more from in this case, or in addition to? So stay tuned. Thanks for joining us again today. And again, thank you to Isabel and to Carrie-Lee for just a phenomenal opportunity to engage our members. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.